Welcome everyone to the Road to HIPAA Compliance webinar series sponsored by Kirkpatrick Price. Today's topic is risk analysis and risk management. And Kirkpatrick Price is a licensed CPA firm. We specialize in information security and regulatory compliance audits. We provide assurance services to over 400 clients in more than 46 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. And since we've been in business for the last 12 years, we have been specializing in compliance frameworks such as HIPAA High-Tech, ISO 27001, 27799, and the PCI Data Security Standard. Some of the things that we do when we're working with covered entities and business associates is on the regulatory compliance side. We provide consulting in policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan development, and readiness audits when you are getting ready for some type of regulatory review. And for information security, we provide guidance and audit dealing with different frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 2, SSA E16, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001. The session today has been contributed by two individuals primarily. My name is Joseph Kirkpatrick. I'm the managing partner here at Kirkpatrick Price, and I'm a CISSP, Certified Information Systems Auditor, certified in the governance of enterprise IT, and also the risk of information systems control. And I work with people who are trying to get ready for complying with these different matters. So I help people with data security, IT governance, and other audit readiness type of services. I can be reached at joseph@kirkpatrickprice.com. Also, Gary Boardman contributed to today's session. He is a compliance auditor with the Office for Civil Rights with the Department of Health and Human Services. He is a CISSP, Certified Information Systems Auditor, and he's also a certified internal auditor. And his specialty is risk analysis and HIPAA compliance. He can be reached at gary.boardman@hhs.gov. And if you were able to attend the last webinar that we did last month, we talked about some of the biggest issues that were findings from the Phase 1 audits performed by the Office for Civil Rights. And the top issue that was discovered out there was an ineffective risk analysis. A lot of organizations had not addressed the requirement for risk analysis in a proper way. And one of the things that we highlighted at the end of that session, which, by the way, you can download on our website at kirkpatrickprice.com if you didn't have a chance to listen to that session. There is a recording available for you there. But we talked about the security risk assessment tool, and this is something that was developed in collaboration with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, HHS, and the Office of the General Counsel for HHS. And the link is provided for you there in the slide, and you will also receive a recording of this session if you registered for it. And we wanted you to take a look at that tool before our session today because I think it's a great place to start. If you are struggling with risk assessment, if you have a lot of questions about what you should be doing to prepare for demonstrating your risk analysis and risk management capabilities, this is a great place to start. And I want to illustrate a few things from the tool. It's a very effective tool. It helps walk you through the requirements for your risk analysis. And what you can see here is if we move left to right of the light blue tabs that we see on the screen there, you're able to create different users in your organization that will contribute to the documentation in the risk assessment tool. You'll be able to document information about your practice if you are a covered entity. You'll be able to document the business associates that you work with in your organization, and then you will be able to conduct an asset inventory. This example here that they provide in the security risk assessment tool shows that one of their assets is electronic health records, EHR. And they provide a description about what the asset is. And then in the third field there, they have a selection where they can say that they receive electronic healthcare information, they transmit electronic healthcare information, or they store electronic healthcare information. And you designate that for each asset that you document into this tool, and then you put the name of the responsible party with that. So Jane Doe is the person who is the asset owner, so to speak. And when you enter those users into the tool, each of those users is able to log in and provide documentation around their controls with these different assets that they're trying to protect. And it's a good way to organize the information. And from our standpoint, the reason we want to show you this tool is because if this was the biggest finding in the phase 1 audits, obviously the Office for Civil Rights will be highly in tune with an organization's risk analysis and having documentation sufficient in this area. So it's something to take note of. And if they have gone to the trouble of collaborating and providing this tool for you to use, then I think we should understand how the tool works as a way to indicate what it is that they expect us to do in the topic of risk assessment, risk analysis, and risk management. As you go through the tool, it will ask you questions that are relevant to the particular section of the law. So here we are looking at a question relating to section 164.308A1I, and the question is, does your practice develop, document, and implement policies and procedures for assessing and managing risks to its electronic protected health information? Yes, no, or you can flag it for yourself to be able to come back to and address it if you're not able to sufficiently answer that question. And right in the middle of the screen there, you have a way to document your current activities. What are you currently doing about your policies and procedures in this area? Make notes to yourself. If it's something that you need to take action on and improve, you've got the tab there for remediation where you can start documenting what you're going to do to remediate the issue. And down at the bottom, the thing that I wanted to highlight is there's a section for likelihood and impact. And so, to what level is the likelihood of not having, these policies and procedures in place? To what impact is that to you? Is that low? Is that medium? Is that high? It's a purely subjective matter that you evaluate for yourself as far as how you feel it impacts you and the likelihood of it. And when you do that, when you check all these boxes and put the notes in, it's the core component to completing a risk assessment. And the other good thing about the tool is on the right, there's some additional information, things to consider, threats and vulnerabilities that are out there, as well as examples of safeguards that you might consider. So it brings it all together into one screen, and if you're just starting with risk assessment, it's a great learning tool in order to address this requirement of the HIPAA law. And ultimately, when you finish all the questions and flag things and mark your likelihood and your impact, then you're able to export the information into your report, and that can be a PDF, that can be Excel, and it allows you to get that documentation out in order to share with your internal auditors, any third parties that might be assessing you, and then of course regulatory auditors that might want to see evidence that you have conducted a risk analysis. And that's how the tool can help you to bring that together. And so the main point that I want to make about this is you don't have to use this tool. There's nothing that says you have to go through these steps the way this tool outlines it. There are a lot of tools out there. We have a tool. Everybody has a tool, to conduct risk assessment. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. The question that people always have is, what is enough? What are we trying to accomplish with this? And the main thing that I want to stress is documentation. When a regulatory auditor comes in, they are going to want to see that you have thought about these matters that we just illustrated in the tool, and they're going to want to see documentation as evidence that you have done these things. Have you identified your assets? Do you know who the asset owner is? who are your business associates? Have you ranked these things by likelihood and impact? Did you have to do some remediation? If so, what did you do? Show me the documentation of that. What controls did you put into place? Administrative, technical, and physical. You know, let's see the documentation of that. So this issue is all about documenting, because truth be told, risk analysis happens in our organizations every day. We talk about issues that affect us. We have incidents, we have problems that come up, and we talk about how to fix that so that it doesn't ever happen again. And if you can document those things along the way, if you can get your team together into a conference room for a day and talk through these matters and have someone document it, you have performed a risk analysis, and you will have the proper documentation to provide to that third party who asks for evidence that you're doing that. And ultimately, that's what a risk assessment is. It's demonstrating that management and those responsible for overseeing these assets and these controls are able to articulate their risks, and that they have determined how they're going to manage those risks. And that's what a security management program is. What are our risks, and how did we choose to manage them? And key elements of a risk assessment were illustrated in that tool that we just walked through. Identify the assets, identify threats to those assets, and determine to what level you might be affected when a threat comes into play. So for example, any room that you're sitting in right now probably has a door or a window, and that is a vulnerability. And what's the threat? The threat is someone who's unauthorized coming through one of those entrances, one of those entry points. And how do you manage that? What do you put into place to make sure that that risk is controlled? And so you do that, and that's what my point is here about critical components of security management. That is your administrative controls that you put into place, the policy about how we restrict unauthorized people for coming into our location where we store electronic records, technical controls such as, you know, some type of electronic monitoring that's happening on particular systems. If somebody is unauthorized and trying to log into a device, what kind of technical controls are in place? And then also physical controls. Do we have a lock on the door? Do we have video cameras monitoring the entrances when people try to enter those areas? And so that is the process of risk analysis and risk management at a high level, and it's something that any organization can talk through themselves. And really, the organization is the one that knows the best about those risks. You know, sometimes it's hard when a company comes to us and says, "We want you to do a risk assessment for us." Well, we can't do a risk assessment for you. We can facilitate it. We can help you. We can guide you. We can, you know, teach you about the different principles of risk assessment. But ultimately, you are the best assessor of the risk in your environment. You have a better understanding of that, and that's where the best, most valuable information is going to come from. Risk analysis is mandated by a lot of the most well-known frameworks that are out there. And of course, we're focused on HIPAA, Title 45 of the CFR, Section 164.308. It says that you must do a risk assessment. SSA E16 and SOC 2 frameworks require that the controls that you put into place be based on an assessment of risk. ISO 27001 is the same way. The federal government standard, FISMA, requires that as well. And the PCI data security standard also mandates that you perform a risk assessment. And the particular section that we're interested in here about risk analysis and risk management, Section 164.308, says that you must conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information held by the covered entity or the business associate. And in the section dealing with risk management, it says that you must implement security measures sufficient to reduce risks and vulnerabilities to a reasonable and appropriate level. And you can probably imagine the main questions that we get when an organization is undertaking their annual risk analysis is, what is accurate and thorough? You know, what is enough? What do we need to do in order for this exercise to be accurate and thorough? And then when you implement security measures, what's sufficient? You know, what is reasonable? What is appropriate? And that's where you do have to look to some type of framework or standard or expert in the process in order to help you understand sometimes what is reasonable and what's appropriate in your situation. That's the part that gets a little subjective sometimes, and it makes people uncomfortable. There are 5 steps to risk assessment, and they're illustrated in that security risk assessment tool that we demonstrated. You first of all conduct a risk assessment survey. That's identifying your assets. Let's take a survey of everything that we're trying to protect. We have electronic protected healthcare information in this database over here, and that's an asset. It's electronic information. We have paper records stored over here or at a third-party location. Those are assets that we're trying to protect. We're also trying to protect our people. Who are the people that are involved in this area of protected healthcare information? What are the threats to the people? What are the processes? That's another asset. You know, what's our process in delivering our services to patients or delivering our services as a business associate to covered entities? What are those processes? That's an asset that has to be protected, and there are threats against those things. And then lastly, I would say physical locations. You take a survey of the physical area where you might have information. And probably the most common thing that people miss are third-party locations where you have stored records or you have a third-party service provider who is providing some type of service to you, and they have remote access to that information. You know, that's an asset as well. So you take that survey, and then you start talking about risks. And this is a brainstorming session. You want to talk about what are the risks to this electronic database. Those risks are going to look much different than the risk of protecting a physical location. And so you have to brainstorm, you know, what are the things that happen here? When you talk about physical things, your geography will dictate a lot of that. People on the West Coast are going to have a different set of concerns dealing with earthquakes, forest fires, things like that, as compared to somebody who lives in Oklahoma, has an operation in Oklahoma. And so you have to consider those things as you are identifying risks, and you're going to assess the importance of those risks and the likelihood of it being exposed by some type of a threat out there. And then you have to put a risk management plan into place to address each of those risks that you've identified, and then you have to implement it. Someone has to have the responsibility of carrying it over the finish line. How are we going to implement these things that are going to control our risks, and how do we monitor to make sure we're doing a good job with this, and, you know, follow up at least once a year on updating this, because risks change from time to time because of growth, because of additional locations, because of new people, and all these things contribute to the need to perform frequent and follow-up risk assessments. And a lot of organizations start down this path. They do one simply because they are told they have to do it. You know, if you want to work with us, you're going to have to do one. If you want to have a relationship with this insurance plan, they require that you have a risk analysis. If you're a business associate and you want to do business in the healthcare market, you know, you have to do a risk assessment because they're making you do it. I'm trying to comply with this law, and the law is forcing me to do a risk assessment. A lot of times people start there. They start documenting a risk assessment because they're being forced to do it. But one of the things that we like to help people see long term after they start realizing the benefits of risk assessment is what you ultimately care about is protecting your assets. You know, nobody wants their organization to be breached by a hacker. Nobody wants their organization to suffer loss because of an incident such as fire or flood or theft. You know, these kinds of things we really care about at a basic level for our organizations. We want to protect those things. And so it's a very helpful exercise to prepare you for those things happening. And when you go through the process and you have the final result, which is a formalized risk assessment, it's such a valuable tool to manage your risks and manage your budget. You know, a lot of times organizations are very haphazard in how they deal with risk. And it's like, okay, well, we've got this problem over here. We've got this fire to put out, so to speak. So let's, you know, spend some money and address this. Oh, now this happened over here. Let's jump and address that. By completing a formal risk assessment, you have a guide to what are my priorities. We've got a lot of threats out there. We've got a lot of things that we have to think about, but by ranking them and prioritizing them, we have a guide to help us set our budgets and help us determine how we're going to conduct our business. And that's really the way that risk assessment needs to be approached. Also, I want to take a moment to remind everybody, because I didn't say it at the top of the session, if you have a question that you'd like to have answered at the end of today's session, please be sure to visit the chat window or the Q&A window and type that in, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that are submitted at the end of the program today. So let's talk a little bit more about conducting your risk assessment. How do we start quantifying our risk? And the formula that I'm giving you here in order to quantify your risk is, what is the vulnerability times the threat? Let's take some type of quantitative approach on our vulnerabilities and our threats, and let's put those together in order to come up with a risk score. And, you know, risk is a condition that results when vulnerabilities and threats act upon critical assets. I was in a situation one time where a client that I had helped with risk assessment had another auditor come in who, you know, thought a little differently than I did, and this auditor was concerned about the server room door. And when it got down to it, the person just wanted them to just seal up the door. You know, they just wanted them to put cement over it and just never go through this door. And of course that wasn't practical. You know, we can't eliminate all risk. You know, there is a risk to having a door that goes into the server room where all this critical data is. But what is the level of the risk? What level of risk are we comfortable with? Because they had an access card reader on the door that logged who used their card. They had video cameras to see and have a record of who went in and out of the facility. And so by looking at what the vulnerability is and what the threat is and scoring that, you can rank your risk and understand what your true condition is in that situation. And when you're following a methodology in ranking risks and trying to document how you do this, you can look to some third-party tools that are out there, some guidance standards that are provided. Of course, we've already talked about the Health and Human Services risk assessment tool that has been published. You've got risk assessment methodologies from NIST and Octave and FRAP and COBRA. You know, these are standards that you would want to point to and say, you know, we followed the guidance that's provided here by an industry expert, an industry standard that's out there, so that you can show how you quantified things. And you'll see some differences from one to the other about how risk gets quantified. And again, I want to reiterate that there's no one right way to do this. You know, this needs to be your risk assessment, and you will determine your scoring and what you're comfortable with in terms of accepting risk and implementing the controls to do that. And so when you go through this process of risk analysis, and we've talked about most of this already, you're trying to get to a place where you can have in front of you a ranking of the risks. What are the most critical assets that we're trying to protect? What are the greatest risks that our organization is facing? And what are we doing in order to limit this vulnerability to our organization? And so I want to give you some examples from each one so that you can think about it as you conduct your own risk analysis. When you're looking at assets and you identify those assets that I mentioned before, they usually fall into these buckets here: hardware, software, HR, data, a process, and you're looking for categorizing these assets into different groupings so that you can address them one at a time. You'll have different people in your organization who will know more about this. You know, people in IT will know more about hardware and software, but your human resources staff will know more about the people. You know, your guards, your security guards will know more about the people and the physical locations and the risks that you face there. And then, of course, your day-to-day operational staff will know the best about what information must they have to do their jobs, what processes do they rely on to be able to successfully execute their tasks. And you'll look for those assets and categorize them that way. And then when you look at the threats to those things, you're looking for, you know, what are the man-made threats to this process that we're trying to protect here? What are natural events that can happen that could take advantage of the flaw inherent in this asset? There's always a flaw. There's always a vulnerability. I already mentioned there's always a door that goes into a room. Electronic information always has a potential flaw to it because someone could lose it, it could be corrupted, an unauthorized person could access it. So there's always a flaw that could be exposed by any of these threats. And so you want to think about the threats and how they affect security. And security is known by this triad of CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. How does this threat affect these three elements of security? I like to think about records, hard copy records, because I think we can illustrate these three things from that. If you've got patient records in a box on a shelf and you lose that box, it may not be a confidentiality issue. It may not be in the hands of somebody who's unauthorized. It just may be lost, and it's going to take you some time to find it. And so we know that it didn't leave the building. We know that somebody didn't steal it. So we haven't lost confidentiality, but the fact that we don't know where the box is a loss of availability. And we can't have security if we can't put our hands on the asset and use it for its purpose for which it was intended. Let's say that there's a false alarm in the building and your sprinkler system goes off, and that box of records gets completely soaked and all the pages are just stuck together, and you're going to have to hire a company to come in and dry out all the paper and restore all the paper to its readable state again. You've had a loss of availability, like we talked about in the first illustration there, but you've also got a loss of integrity because the data is lost. You can't read it. It hasn't been stolen. We haven't had a loss in confidentiality. We know where it is, but the data is not usable because the water has damaged it and we can't read the information, we can't use the information. We've had a loss of integrity. And then, of course, if an unauthorized person comes and picks up the box and takes it and steals it, we've got a loss of confidentiality and availability. And so you look at those threats to those different assets, and it's a really effective way to think about these three areas so that you can document all the potential threats, because there are different threats that can happen to the assets: the sprinklers, a thief, or somebody not following a process and losing it. And you think through that as you're identifying the different threats. And so then you look at the vulnerabilities, and you say, what is the known or unknown flaw or weakness in this asset? And again, just using the paper records illustration, the flaw is that the printed material can fade over time, and so it might not be usable or readable later if we go back when we need it. It's a hard copy piece of thing. It's got a finite location in space, and if we lose it, where is it? It's gone. It's our only copy of that. And so that's a flaw in that type of thing. And so you identify what the vulnerability is for each asset that you're trying to protect. You might have different types of assets. Like you might have one location where I go into a lot of data centers that's hosting electronic protected healthcare information, and you'll have one data center that has multiple stages of entry into the facility where you're locked in the middle of these doors on either side of you, and they've put those kind of controls in place, whereas another data center doesn't have that. And you have different types of vulnerabilities based on how a location is configured, and so you have to consider what the vulnerability is to the asset that you're trying to protect. And so then when you've identified your assets and your threats and your vulnerabilities, you start thinking about how are we currently controlling this vulnerability? How are we currently monitoring or restricting these threats that could potentially impact this vulnerability and create some type of a loss for us? And you document that. This is what we're currently doing. And then you have a conversation about anything that you should be doing. There was a time in our organization's history when we were at the beginning and smaller where we had an application that we relied on, and it was in our office. It was on a server in our server room. Over time, that was sufficient at the beginning, but over time, it started to become an issue where, well, we need to have more redundancy. We need to have, what if a tornado hit this building and took it down? We need to have it to be available for our employees and our customers to use, if that were to happen. So you start to think about other controls. Your needs there for the controls that you put into place can change over time. So you think about that when you do your control analysis about what you're currently doing. And then you think about what's the likelihood of this event happening that could have a negative effect on the asset. And you can choose whatever scale you want to use. Some people use low, medium, high. Some people use a numerical approach, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, there's no right way to do this. You can choose what that scale is that you're going to use, because ultimately you have to sit down and say, what is the likelihood of this threat to us? If we have a location where the threat is breaking and entering, you might have one location where you say, there's a high risk of this happening here, and I'm going to say that that's a 5. But you might have another location where you say the risk of breaking and entering happening at this location is a 3. And sometimes people obsess over, the rating of these things. But it's your decision to make, Is it a 5 or is it a 3? Maybe it's a 4. I'm not going to tell somebody what that is. I want them to make that determination. You have to score it in some way as far as what the likelihood is that this thing would happen. And then what's the potential impact to us if it were to happen? If someone were to hack into our database of EPHI, what's the impact? Is there a time impact? It's a delay in our ability to perform our services. Is it monetary? We're going to lose revenue because we can't perform our services. Our database is gone. We can't look up records. We can't serve the patients in the best way possible, and so we're going to have a monetary hit in that situation. Or it might be intangible. Sometimes people are concerned about not having met their compliance requirements because they end up in the news, or they go through a a regulatory exam and there's negative press, there's fines and penalties that come from that can be monetary impact as well as intangible impact. So you try to determine what that potential impact would be on you and rank that. And then you determine if these things are material or non-material in what you're doing as an organization. Is it an asset that you say, yes, it does have a vulnerability, yes, there are threats, but if it were to be impacted, it really, at the end of the day, doesn't have a material impact on what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve in our compliance with the law and with protecting information. Maybe it's something that's inconsequential that you would consider to be non-material. And then after all of this, when you're starting to get to the end of this process, you look across the table with everybody and you say, okay, now what? What do we do? Now that we have this knowledge, now that we've educated ourselves on our controls and our threats and our vulnerabilities and assets, what do we need to do? What are the action steps and who is responsible for the action of each one of these items? So we can mitigate the risk, just like I talked about before with our server that was running an important application for us. We can mitigate that risk by setting up some redundancy and having, off-site instances of that application that's available in the case of an outage. We can transfer the risk by outsourcing it to another party. I can host my application with Amazon, and I can say, okay, Amazon is gonna host this now, and they're gonna provide the redundancy and the critical services around this particular application that we have. We can just accept the risk. We can say, you know what, we're not going to change anything with how we're controlling this right now. We're just going to accept what it is, and that's a proper approach to take. If it's something that you decide that we're comfortable with this amount of risk, and we're going to document the fact that we're comfortable with it, that's a way to do it. And then, of course, you can avoid the risk by changing your processes, implementing some different solutions to what you're doing in order to avoid the risk altogether. But this has happened multiple times. It's funny when it happens, but sometimes somebody will do a risk assessment. They'll hire a third party to help them do a risk assessment, and they want their report to say, that they're going to share with other people, regulators and whatnot. They want the report to say that they have no risk. Can I get a report that, takes these risks out? I don't want people to know that we have risk. I've been asked that multiple times. Can you remove this from my report, because I don't want to show my partner over here that I have this risk, and that's just not reality. We have risk. What's important is that you have done a risk analysis and you know what your risks are, because the people who are not doing a great job with risk management are the people who put their head in the sand and don't go to this level of analyzing the risk and knowing what it is. That's half the battle, of knowing our risks and understanding it, getting to this point of determining what are we going to do. We're going to mitigate, we're going to transfer, and that's ultimately where you want to be. Because when an auditor comes in from the Office for Civil Rights and says, show me evidence that you have performed risk analysis, and let's look at your risk management process, they're not going to want to see something that says, oh, everything's peachy keen over here, there's no risk going on over here. That's going to be a red flag. You're going to want to show that, yes, we have proactively dealt with this, we know what our risks are, we have the documentation to show what we're doing with it. That's a healthy organization. That's a mature process when you're at that point, and you can articulate that and demonstrate what your process is. I mentioned before about prioritizing the risks and how helpful that is, because you can't do everything. You can't implement just the fanciest controls that are out there, and there are restraints for us, constraints in terms of time and budget and resources. Our organization can't say, well, if our building burns down, we want to have a building over here ready to go with equipment and you know, just a duplication of what we had over here. We can't do that. There's a budget restriction on us to do that, and so that's not our approach with doing it. And so completing this risk analysis will help you determine, what do we have the time to do? What do we have the budget to do? What do we have the resources to do? And now you can take some intelligent steps towards dealing with these things by working on it within the constraints of what you have in your organization. So with that, we're going to stop and answer some questions. Hopefully this has been helpful for you today in thinking about risk assessment, and I would like to encourage you to think about who can help you with it in your organization, because you have to get different people from different departments and different layers of the organization to bring different views and questions into it. You will have someone in receiving who has a totally different perspective on risk than someone in the lab or on the patient floors. People in executive management will understand certain risks and threats to the organizations, but they won't know some of the day-to-day things that the people, you know, dealing with the patients on a daily basis will deal with. So get that cross-section of your organization together and start thinking about how you can approach this. I definitely encourage you to get familiar with the security risk assessment tool. Look into one of those risk assessment methodologies that we mentioned before, and start educating yourself on how you might improve your process if you're already doing risk assessment. You know, what are you missing? What are you not documenting? Hopefully there were some things here today that will prompt you in that area and help you get better in this process. I'm looking here for some of the questions. If you do have a question, please submit it into the Q&A or chat windows. The only question that we have so far is recommendations on format in terms of a risk assessment. I've seen all kinds of different things. Probably the most common thing I've run across is a spreadsheet type of format with tabs, you know, dealing with the different classifications of assets, and that's fine. You know, that's really the heart and soul of the risk assessment. You know, the columns dealing with the asset owner, what are the vulnerabilities to this asset, what are the threats, what is the ranking of, you know, the likelihood of this threat, what is the ranking of the impact of this threat. Okay, let's take those two columns and multiply them together and have a risk determination there so that we can then sort the spreadsheet by the highest risk so that we have those things at the top. That's probably the most common thing that I see in terms of how it gets presented to an auditor or a regulatory agent, you know, demonstrating your documentation in that area. I'd like to see a higher level executive summary to go along with the data. You know, what would be in the spreadsheet would be the data, but a higher level executive summary report would maybe talk about your remediation plan, and it would talk about existing controls and how you monitor them. And you're going to reference back to a lot of your existing policy and procedure documentation. You're going to have a risk assessment policy. And the policy can be very simple. It just says that this organization is going to conduct a risk assessment on an annual basis. And then you have a risk assessment procedure where you outline all of these things that we've talked about today. You know, and this document is going to talk about the process of how we do it. And so then maybe this executive level type of report that you have to show your risk assessment results will point back to those policies and procedures. They will point back to other policies that you have, such as your information security policy, that deals with physical security and technical security. You know, it'll talk about the controls that you've put into place and how you monitor those and make sure that you are managing those risks on a regular basis. A couple other questions here. How often should an internal risk assessment be done? At least annually. It really depends on the size and complexity of your organization. There are some organizations that are very complex, a lot of departments and divisions, and you know they will have different levels of risk assessment happening within the organization on an ongoing basis, whereas somebody who's smaller in size and complexity will go through this process once a year. But you'll find that the standards that are out there refer to an annual process there. And does risk assessment apply to covered entities and business associates? Yes. First of all, the requirement is for either or both of the covered entities or business associates to conduct the accurate and thorough risk analysis. And in the phase 1 audit that took place, there were findings in reference to both, you know, having weaknesses there in conducting the risk analysis. So it is applicable to both. Okay, and just checking to see. Another question that we get a lot: should I fix all of my known issues before doing my first risk assessment? We never will get to the place where we do a risk assessment if we have the mindset of, I got to fix all my problems. You know, as I said before, we just all need to acknowledge that we have risk and we all have problems. We all have issues in organizations, things that could be better, controls that we know we should have implemented by now, but we haven't. You know, that does not excuse the fact that we should still conduct risk analysis. Those kinds of findings will just be part of what we do in our risk analysis, and maybe that will be the catalyst to help us address it and determine if it's something that we do need to take action on. So those are good questions. I really appreciate that and appreciate everyone joining today. Everyone who attended today will receive our Kirkpatrick Price risk assessment template to help get you started. We have some files that are helpful in helping you organize your assets, and so you can take a look at that in light of the security risk assessment tool that we mentioned at the beginning and see if it can help you get started. Of course, we are here to assist you and help you and guide you. If you have questions about this process, please reach out to us and let us know how we can help. The purpose of this webinar series is to provide a roadmap for you, and we're taking a prioritized approach. We're talking about things that we already know are of greatest interest to Health and Human Services and that were found in the phase 1 audits, and so we were talking about those things first. Risk analysis was at the top of the list. Breach notification was another major issue, and that's what we'll talk about in February. If you have joined our webinar series in the past, you will receive an invitation to this next event. We will announce the date and time, and you'll have an opportunity to register and participate in our next session. We really appreciate you joining, and if you are looking for resources, please visit kirkpatrickprice.com to find previous webinars that we've performed so that you can listen to the recordings and download any other documentation that you might find helpful on our website. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.